Hello everyone and welcome to the course. This is part of the introductory part of the course, a very brief reading from Aristotle's Metaphysics, and just some brief comments that I'd like to make. This is not any kind of complicated introduction to the course. I'm not going to try to explain any of the difficult concepts that we will be working with in the course. That'll come later. I mean, the level of difficulty of our readings is I think, moderate to high. Some of them at least, and that my job as a teacher is simply to help you read these things, which I think are great, and talk about really interesting things, but to help you read them more profitably. And so I'm kind of a facilitator in that respect. And so many of the videos that I'll be doing will look very closely at the text and maybe get pretty involved, but not this one. Here I don't want to try to explain any deep concepts to you. I don't want to go into any detail. I just want to maybe explain the spirit of this course, or some of the presuppositions of this course. If we look at the readings that I've asked you to look at for this introduction, two excerpts from the first part of Aristotle's book, The Metaphysics. The first line of the Metaphysics is all men, and of course I think we would mean all human beings, but all men by nature desire to know. I think that it's a good thing to keep in mind. That's kind of the presupposition of this course, that is all of us, we human beings, by our very nature, by just being human beings, have a thirst for knowledge, a desire to know, a desire for knowledge. Now, if we look at what Aristotle's talking about, kind of distinction that he's making there, he's making, I would say, a stronger claim than might first appear. All men by nature desire to know. Well, much of what we desire to know is for practical purposes. Right? Sometimes it seems like it's all for practical purposes. I want to know which side of the road to drive on in this particular country. I want to know how to properly fill out a tax form. And I want to know these things because I have practical ends that I want to achieve. I want to know which side of the road to drive on in this particular country because I want to drive safely. I want to know how to fill out the tax form because I want to obey the law, let's say. That's what Aristotle would call practical or utilitarian knowledge, or wanting knowledge for utilitarian purposes. That is not what this course is about, right? This is, as a philosophy course in dealing with the subjects of reality and knowledge, or epistemology and metaphysics, it is not a course that is going to fulfill many practical purposes. It is a course that sort of presupposes that, yes, some things we desire to know because we want to use that knowledge to attain some end. But Aristotle is just talking about the idea that some of the things that we want to know for their own sake. That is, not for the purposes of using that knowledge to gain anything in the world for ourselves or for anyone else, but rather that we want the knowledge for its own sake. He continues, an indication of this, that is, this natural desire to know, is the delight we take in our senses. For even apart from their usefulness, of course, our senses, sight, touch, hearing, smell, taste, they are useful. But he says, even apart from their usefulness, they are loved for themselves, as we just enjoy seeing and hearing and smelling and tasting and touching. And above all others, the sense of sight. That is, he's saying that the sense of sight is the most delightful, the most important, the one we take most joy in exercising. He continues, for not only with a view to action, but even when we are not going to do anything, we prefer seeing, one might say, to everything else. The reason is that this, most of all the senses, makes us know and brings to light many differences between things. Very interesting example he uses there, isn't it? That is that we take delight in just the use of our senses, listening to music for its own sake, looking at something beautiful for its own sake, tasting, obviously, for its own sake. Something that tastes good. But of all these things, he says it's sight that's the most important. And we can say that sight has great, of course, utilitarian or practical value, but that we enjoy seeing things for its own sake. And he says the reason for that is because it's sight that makes us know more than any of the other senses. Now, that needs some interpretation, and there's no need to go too far into that now. But what's important is that Aristotle's made a certain claim about us, and that is that by nature we want to know. We are curious. We value knowledge for its own sake. Now, we don't just value it for its own sake. In many cases, the only reason we want to know something is because we have a purpose that's fulfilled through that knowledge. But there are other things that we want to know for their own sake. And in the next excerpt here, he begins to suggest sort of what kind of things those really are. He says, for it is owing to their wonder, that sense of wonderment, sort of wondering at something, being amazed by something, being curious about something, being in some way or another interested and puzzled by something. For it is owing to their wonder that men both now begin, and at first began, thinking of earlier people, to philosophize. They wondered originally at the obvious difficulties, then advanced little by little, and stated difficulties about the greater matters. For example, about the phenomena of the moon and those of the sun and the stars, and about the genesis of the universe. So, there's an example of the kind of thing Aristotle at least thinks that human beings do want to know for their own sakes. Like, how did the world begin? The genesis of the universe. Does the universe and all the cosmos, everything we know, does it have a beginning in time? He talks about the heavenly bodies. I mean, wondering about the things that appear in the sky. Are they different worlds? How do they move? What determines their movement? The whole of astronomy. Those sort of things, to some extent, you could say that those sort of things have a practical value, but they mostly don't. That is, knowing the origin of the universe, that is, the notion of how did the world begin. Did God create the world? Was it an accident and a collision of forces that created, what came before? I mean, those sort of questions are very, very interesting questions for us. But they don't have a lot of practical value. I mean, in the sense that we want to know the answers to those questions. But we want that knowledge for its own sake. Now, this is a big distinction here for Aristotle between practical or utilitarian knowledge and knowledge you want for its own sake. I think that the reason I'm starting here and asking you to read this very classic beginning of Aristotle's Metaphysics is that kind of explains the kind of approach we'll be taking. None of what we do is really going to have immediate practical value for you, and what it presupposes is that you have some curiosity about the kind of questions that what is real? What is the nature of reality? Is it possible to really know that you know things? How does how does mental life fit in with physical life? These sort of classic questions of metaphysics and epistemology are the kind of questions we'll be dealing with, and I think they really fall into the category of things that we would want to know for their own sake, things that we are intrinsically interested in because they're the kind of things that our natural desire to know gives us an inclination towards. Now, he ends this by making a very interesting claim. He says, but as the man is free, we say, who exists for his own sake and not for another's, so we pursue this philosophy, as the only free science, for it alone exists for its own sake. That is, Aristotle believes that maybe a thing's practical irrelevance makes it even more important, because then it's something that we pursue for its own sake, as opposed to, say, a practical knowledge, like learning how to, be an accountant, right? Now, that's a profession, a very difficult profession, a very important profession. But the kind of skills an accountant picks up are for the purposes of doing his or her job. Maybe not the kind of thing you would spend years studying unless you had an idea that you want to make your living as an accountant. And law, too. Philosophy is, in Aristotle's mind, something that the philosophical questions, something that we pursue for their own sakes, they don't have a lot of practical utility. They won't get us anywhere except maybe in a better position to understand ourselves and the world. But for Aristotle, this kind of class is really here we are the most free, because we're not studying something for the sake of doing something else. We're studying something because we're interested in it. And for Aristotle, it's a very noble enterprise.